Okay, although scientists have observed and classified about 1.2 million species of animals, they estimate that there are approximately 8.7 million living animal species on Earth. We've only found a portion of animal life, they suggest. Now, many of these presumed missing creatures exist in the ocean. Now, Noah did not have to preserve and tend to ocean life, which certainly made his job easier. But there's still a dazzling array of diversity in the animal world that thrives on land, which came from the relatively few animals that had exited the ark. Now, we would believe that much of the current diversity is a result of evolution on a small scale, where birds, for example, living in different conditions, will change to adapt to their environment. When the ark was prepared, God tells Noah that animals, quote, after their kind, will come to him for their safekeeping. So while scientists will distinguish between, say, a barn swallow and a house swallow, these different types of birds likely originated from the same type of bird that I'd like to picture roosted in the ark rafters. There's a tortoise found on the Galapagos Islands that is unique to every type of turtle or tortoise found elsewhere on Earth. I think it'd be a fascinating story to uncover how that first breeding pair of tortoises initially arrived on these islands. The 127 islands that are grouped together as the Galapagos are over 600 miles from the South American coast, after all. Now, in 2004, there was a tortoise that walked up onto an African beach. It originated from an island in the Indian Ocean about 450 miles away. So between drifting and swimming, it is possible for animals to travel great distances on the sea. Now, along these lines, I wondered how animals in general got to the Americas. Now, in Genesis 8:4, we are told the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, this general geographic area would be approximately in eastern Turkey, near the border with Armenia. How did the gray squirrel, who harasses my bird feeders in the winter, get from there to Minnesota? Well, whether there were lower sea levels in the past where land bridges would have existed, or whether animals hopped a ride on floating debris, or whether humans transported animals around, animals did populate the earth after the flood. I think there will be many fascinating stories that will explain exactly how this all happened. Now, one animal in particular that became my focus was the sloth. Now, sloths are found only in Central and Northern South America, places like Costa Rica and Panama and Peru and Brazil. There is no academic revelation that sloths ever lived in Africa or Europe or Asia. Sloths, or something of their kind, would have left the ark in the mountains of Ararat when the flood waters receded. But there is nothing in science that reveals anything like a sloth that established habitats in that area. Now, there are several species or types of sloth, and every one of them, outside of zoos, exists in the jungles of Central and South America. Now, we probably all know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in what year? 1492, right? Around his time, many explorers were sailing the oceans. Well, there would have been trade and exchanges of goods between the various peoples of the earth, and I would guess that this would include animals and was probably the beginning of the feasibility of zoos as we would think of them today. And men have transported animals in the past that have resulted in devastation for native wildlife. In New Zealand, for example, the kiwi bird, which seems to have had no natural predators, is now threatened because of ferrets, cats, and dogs that men brought to the two islands. Now, prior to the time of Columbus, Norse peoples from Scandinavia traveled via the sea and established base camps in places like Greenland and Newfoundland. This was about 500 years before Columbus. Now, there is, in fact, a runestone museum in my town of Alexandria, Minnesota, that was established because of an artifact that was dated to 1362. There are Nordic carvings on this flat stone that some believe prove that Scandinavian explorers found their way to central Minnesota long before Columbus landed in the Bahamas. Now, there is a history of sailing within the Mediterranean, along the Nile River, and to Southeast Asia prior to the Nordic boats traveling the seas in the first millennia. Join me in Deuteronomy 28, and we'll read verse 68. Deuteronomy chapter 28, and let's read verse 68. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68, the Bible reads, "And the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships, by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again. And there you shall be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you." Moses writes this in a chapter of blessings and curses. Well, this chapter for us today should give us all hope if we choose to follow God, and fear if we don't. There are consequences to bad behavior. Now, this chapter spells out literal and physical consequences, but when we add in the rest of the Bible, we know there are also spiritual and eternal consequences. And sailing here is referenced as a method of transportation back during the time when Israel was in the wilderness. But ocean travel was limited to coastal navigation around Europe, Asia, and Africa. Nordic people like Eric the Red, then followed by the European explorers like Columbus, were the start of when the Eastern Hemisphere connected with the West. I could not find an example of when persistent transatlantic or transpacific voyages were successfully made by men prior to this. The Americas were basically alone and separated in their existence from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 6, we are told that Solomon begins building the temple in Jerusalem. And specifically, we are told that it was 480 years since Israel left Egypt. So, some 480 years or so before the time of Solomon, Moses writes about traveling by ships in what we just read in Deuteronomy. And at the time of Solomon, we have this. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 9, and we'll read verses 20 through 21. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, and let's read verses 20 through 21. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, starting in verse 20. "All King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years the merchant ships came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys." Well, here we are told that Solomon had a fleet of merchant ships, and these ships would periodically sail west to Tarshish, which is believed to be on the south coast of Spain, just beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. So technically, Tarshish was on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, and not along the Mediterranean. But ships going from Israel to Tarshish did not have to traverse any open stretch of ocean water in this voyage. It was about a 2,500-mile journey, however, which is perhaps one reason why Solomon had his ships make this trek just once every 3 years, as we read here. Now, like sloths that are only found in Central and South America, ivory, apes, and monkeys would have come from where? From Africa. Well, today, China and Russia have more gold mines than other countries, and Europe has virtually none. But with Tarshish being on the very western part of Europe, we can assume that Solomon procured gold originating from Africa, and likely from South Africa, rather than from the Far East. I was thinking that Europe, Asia, and Africa were not even remotely aware of the Americas during the time of Solomon, and even long after Solomon's time. You know, when Columbus, when he reached the Bahamas, he believed he found an island in the East Indies. And that's a term referring to a region of islands and mainland in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. He had no clue that two other whole continents, the Americas, existed. Now, the end of Solomon's reign as king is believed to be about 931 BC. Well, this means it was 2,423 years between Columbus and Solomon. Now, if Columbus had no idea of the lands in the Western Hemisphere, I'd conclude that Solomon did not either. Yet, I recall seeing the word sloth in the Bible, in particular in what Solomon authored. Doesn't Proverbs tell us not to be like a sloth in multiple and various ways? Don't be a sloth, don't be lazy like a sloth, things like this. Well, this then led me to ask myself this question, which I'll now pose to you. How did Solomon know about sloths? Paleontologists have uncovered the fossil remains of 3 animals that they categorize as giant sloths, which were found in Iowa. In the 1700s, a Revolutionary War commander named John Stewart found a strange collection of bones in a cave in West Virginia. He actually sent these bones to Thomas Jefferson. Now, these bones are thought to have come from a species of giant sloth, a 10-foot-long beast that weighed over a ton. Now, the forearm and hand bones of this fossil became the state fossil of West Virginia. Similar fossils have been found all across the continental U.S., Canada, and even Alaska. I find no record of sloth bones found anywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, the London Zoo has sloths on display. You can see the two-toed sloth at the National Zoological Garden in Pretoria, South Africa. And like we have pandas and zoos here in the U.S., the Taipei Zoo in China has sloths. But sloths are not, and as far as I can determine, have never been naturally present outside of the Western Hemisphere, apart from when they or something of their kind exited the ark. Now, the term zoo was coined as an abbreviation for the London Zoological Gardens, which opened in 1828. Now, it appears to be the first establishment where animals were kept for exhibition and often bred for conservation purposes. This is 3,354 years after Solomon. I don't think it's likely that Jerusalem would have had a zoo during the time of Solomon, but if it did, well, it probably had animals like camels and goats and perhaps apes and monkeys, which came to Israel on the merchant ships of Solomon. We read about that earlier. Now, on the small chance that there was a zoo back then and there, would a sloth have made its way to some jungle section of such an exhibit in the land of Israel? No, sloths are actually pretty good swimmers, but could they swim the Atlantic? It would have been a long, long time before ships navigated their way to the western lands and back. The question I ask myself again is, how did Solomon know about sloths? Now, in the King James Version of the Bible, searching a concordance for the word sloth, I find it appearing 13 times in the book of Proverbs and once again in Ecclesiastes. These are the writings of Solomon. Now, we know God gave Solomon more wisdom than any other person. Could that wisdom have included knowledge of animals that the whole Eastern Hemisphere had never encountered before? Well, the answer is no. And I can also answer the question about how Solomon knew about sloths. He did not. Let's go to Proverbs 15 and verse 19. Proverbs 15 and verse 19. And I will read the King James Version of Proverbs 15 and verse 19. And that reads as follows. The way of the slothful man is as a hedge of thorns, but the way of the righteous is made plain. Okay. Verses like this answered my question about Solomon and sloths. I had thought that the word sloth appeared often in the Bible, but it never appears to describe the animal itself. It's always used as a description of slow or lazy or describing a lack of motivation. You know, the word included in our Bible when sloth is found is usually the adjective slothful. In the New King James, Proverbs 15 and 19, verse 19 reads, the way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. Now, the NIV translation does not use the word sloth, in particular slothful, at all. The English Standard Version uses sloth just 6 times. And the New King James just has one inclusion of the word sloth. So in looking at this and digging into this a bit, older translations, like the 1599 Geneva Bible and the Wycliffe Bible, included variations of the word sloth a lot more than later translations. Solomon did not know about sloths, but the translators did. They selected slothful as an effective English equivalent to the Hebrew word that means lazy. By the year 1600, the Western Hemisphere and its unique wildlife were becoming common knowledge, at least in the academic circles at that time. This would have included scribes and translators. Now, I imagine it had to be pretty exciting, right, to welcome back explorers and traders and hear of their adventures, as well as perhaps even seeing examples in food and animal life that existed on the other side of the world. I would imagine that there was not an animal found in England or Europe in general that slept as much as a sloth or moved as slowly as a sloth. You know, the visual correlation that we all have when it comes to thinking about a sloth makes a more effective emphasis on the idea of being sluggish or lazy. Well, at least this is the case for me. And the earlier translators agreed with me more than the later translators who began to diminish the use of the word sloth in their versions of the English Bible. I was confident that sloths were mentioned in the Bible. And I thought that it would have been a great example of the wisdom that God gave to Solomon, because there was no feasible way that a sloth could have been known in any area within Solomon's reach, including as far away as Tarshish or the Far East. We would have to conclude that God blessed Solomon with knowledge of even the unknown other side of the world. But I was wrong. And so my own personal lesson here is that I should not assume the Bible records something that it does not. I made an assumption here. I did not listen to the Bible with my complete attention. I was, let's say, lazy in my approach on this topic of Solomon and Sloths. But there was a positive outcome for me. Now, what I learned is that my biblical attention should not be slothful. So I gave the title of this message, Zealous Consideration. Let's go to Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Okay, when Jesus revealed the greatest commandment in the Gospels, the idea was established here when Israel was in the wilderness. Now, we know Egypt and other pagan cultures at the time worshiped a boatload of gods. Well, this verse establishes that there is simply one God, along with reiterating what Jesus later revealed in that he and the Father are one. But the verse begins with something important. Hear. Many translations use listen. Well, yes, the Hebrew word means to hear or listen, but in particular, it means to hear with attention and interest. It means to have the power to hear, to listen with the intent of understanding. Loving God is the most important command we have in the Bible, according to Jesus. And this idea is preceded with the instruction to pay attention. Hear, O Israel. Have zealous consideration, O Israel. Now, the Hebrew word for hear or listen also means to listen in the context of a judicial case. I want to look at an example of this. Join me in 1 Kings chapter 3, and let's read verses 16 through 22. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 through 22. 1 Kings chapter 3, and starting in verse 16. Now 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened, the 3rd day after I had given birth, that this woman also gave birth. And we were together. No one was with us in the house except the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was, dead. But when I had examined him in the morning, indeed, he was not my son who I had borne. Then the other woman said, No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. And the first woman said, No, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. I've read that creative problem solving involves 3 key stages: fact finding, idea finding, and solution finding. Well, we see the first stage here in this example. The king listened. The king did not interrupt. The king was gathering facts. The king gave these women his attention. The king here, of course, is Solomon. Now, note that this judicial example of Solomon's kingship immediately follows the encounter that God had with Solomon in a dream. Solomon was given the opportunity to ask for anything. Well, the first thing he asked for was wisdom. I mean, we see this earlier in this chapter, 1 Kings 3 and verse 9, which I'll just read. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Now, the Hebrew word for hear or listen includes the scope of legal proceedings. Solomon wanted the wisdom to judge the people of Israel. And we see in this example, Solomon listened. He did not interrupt them as they presented their arguments. He was gathering facts. He gave them his attention. All right, continuing the story, verses 23 through 26. And the king said, this one says, this one is my son who lives, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, no, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. Then the king said, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him. Now Solomon was entering the idea-finding stage of creative problem-solving. He restates the problem and then proposes a ridiculous measure of justice, right? Divide the child in half. But in doing so, the true mother is revealed as she responds with love for the child, while the other woman responds with malice. So, just beyond the biological connection the true mother had with her child, she displayed the genuine care of a parent. It was abundantly clear to Solomon and to everyone else who the real mother was. And the solution to this problem was equally transparent. But I do feel a bit uneasy about the end of the story. We're not told of anything that happened to the woman who claimed to be the mother of the child but was lying. I would have wanted to read about punishment for this woman. But, whatever happened to her, I'll submit to whatever Solomon concluded in her matter, which is not documented for us. Solomon was, after all, a lot smarter than I'll ever be. Solomon was not given the wisdom to know about sloths or other animals in the Western Hemisphere, but he was given the wisdom to judge Israel. And in this example, wisdom, and then what proceeds to justice, began with listening. While Solomon did not know about sloths, he did not have slothful attention. God gave Solomon the wisdom to have zealous consideration. Now, at the end of my software career, I did have the opportunity to extend my employment by adapting to a new development environment. There was one other developer in this small company who was, my teacher in a sense. And he was, let's say, a challenging individual to get along with. He would constantly anticipate what I would say, and he'd be wrong about his assumptions so many times. He'd be rehearsing his response while I was still posing a question, and he'd interrupt me all the time. He was an impatient listener. My business relationship with him actually became a factor in my decision to retire early. I just didn't want to have to deal with him on a daily basis, which could have extended potentially for several more years. Our world is very noisy, and this can be the case even in our country farmsteads. With the rise of technology and media, you can choose the racket of modern life quite easily. And this basically replaces conversation with broadcasting. People today, they want brief sound bites rather than lengthy discussions on important topics. It's very hard to pay attention in a noisy world. For many people, their favorite form of relaxation is to plop down in front of a screen to, binge watch some series or scroll endlessly through media posts. But consuming information in this way requires only superficial listening and trains people in these habits. Let's go to Proverbs 18 and verse 2. Proverbs 18 and verse 2. The last scripture we'll turn to in this message, Proverbs 18 and verse 2. Proverbs 18 and verse 2, the Bible reads, "A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart." The biblical fool only finds pleasure in speaking. Because of pride, the biblical fool doesn't care about understanding. The biblical fool just wants to express his own opinion. The biblical fool doesn't want to accept the responsibility of half of a conversation, which is listening. Listening with the goal of understanding, that's just too much work. The biblical fool is lazy in a discussion setting. The biblical fool has slothful attention. Now we know that sloths move slowly, which is one reason why translators used slothful often in the Bible. And I'm thinking that because sloths sleep a lot, this is another aspect which cemented the idea of laziness in the translators' minds when it came to bringing the Bible to the English-speaking world. But you know, it's just sloths in captivity that spend most of their day sleeping, up to 20 hours a day, as some zookeepers report. Sloths in the wild have been studied, and they sleep only about 8 hours a day. 8 hours. That's just about the average time us humans are, sort of nestled beneath our bed quilts and comforters. I'm thinking that if you or I were stuck in a zoo, we'd probably end up sleeping a lot more as well. There's just nothing to do. Seems like that would be a dejected life. I personally do not like the idea of zoos. Sure, one can point out the idea of conservation and that animals in zoos are likely to have very good care. But to me, it's similar to locking a child up in their bedroom. Well, sure, you can take very good care of them there and protect them more easily in these comfort zones. But I don't think it's the purpose of a child to live in such an environment. It's how I feel about animals in zoos. Now, along with this idea, we have a purpose here in our short time in life to engage one another. Now, we can isolate ourselves like we are stuck in a zoo and our lives can drift towards self-centeredness. We can focus on what we think and what we do and avoid interacting with others. And like sloths in a zoo, we'll just end up sleeping more and doing less. We'll develop slothful attention. Engaging one another is a method of avoiding this. I'm advocating for zealous consideration of what the Bible teaches, but also for us to have zealous consideration of each other. In our human bodies, we hold waste in our intestines that is around 0.005% of our complete body weight. Well, that's not a lot, right? We don't carry around a lot of waste, in other words. But one thing that all 6 species of sloths have in common is their slow digestive system. Sloths have a 4-chambered stomach, meaning it can take 30 days for their digestive system to process the leaves that they consume. As a result, up to 2/3 of their body weight can be the leaves in their digestive system. That's a lot of dead weight. Translators likely would not have been aware of this when the 1611 version of the King James Bible was penned down for the English world, but that doesn't mean we can't now learn from this. Being slothful, as recorded in the Bible, is being lazy, lacking motivation, being sluggish. When we see words like slothful, sluggard, or lazy in the Bible, now we can use the idea of a sloth and how much extra useless weight it carries each day. I mean, create a pile of rocks that would weigh 2/3 of your body weight. then put that pile in a backpack and strap it on. How fast would you walk? How far could you walk? Now let's think of this when it comes to the consideration we give one another and the Bible itself. Let's learn from this. Let's have zealous consideration. Let's wake up each day with the idea that we need to focus on God, focus on Jesus, and focus on being attentive to one another. Let's ignore the noise of the world and let the Bible be our focal point in life. And we see this in the life of Solomon as well. He was the greatest leader of his time. Well, sure, he did not know about sloths, but he had the wisdom to judge his people. His attention was on God, and God's eyes were on Solomon, and God's ears were open to Solomon's prayers. Well, then Solomon fell away, with the primary reason being the many pagan gods of his heathen wives. Solomon had slothful attention towards his life and got lost in the noise and bustle of life. But I look at the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes as Solomon coming back to God later in Solomon's life. I look at these books that God wrote through Solomon as a loudspeaker shouting out to us to drop the dead weight that will make us lazy and sluggish. Solomon understood he lost focus, and unselfishly, he wanted to share his enormous pool of God-given wisdom with us. And it was, of course, God's will to pass this information along to us. Loving God and Jesus is the greatest commandment. We cannot do this if we are not focused. Physical and literal blessings were described in the Bible for those who would love God, and we know these blessings extend to eternity for God's children. But these blessings require us to tune out the noise of the world. These blessings require us to avoid having slothful attention. These blessings require us to have zealous consideration. Happy Sabbath, brethren.